All right, let's get started. Okay, wonderful. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's wonderful to have so many of you joining us from all over the world. On behalf of our co-hosts, the University of British Columbia and UN Women, I'd like to welcome all of you to our global webinar, Paths to Equal: Innovative Tools for Measuring Gender Progress. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm in Vancouver. Currently, I saw someone was asking me where I was from or where I'm based. I'm currently based in Vancouver. Vancouver is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I would also like to acknowledge that you are all joining us from different parts of the world. We've already seen in the chat, both near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. My name is Janetta Scona. I'm a visiting practitioner fellow in residence at UBC for the fall term. When not at UBC, I'm a senior data and policy specialist at UN Women, where I served, among other things, as the co-lead of UN Women and UNDP's Path to Equal report. It's a privilege to moderate today's discussion, which brings together insights and expertise from around the world. A few things before we begin, a few housekeeping items. The chat function, which many of you are already using, is available for comments, but also if you have any technical issues during the event, use that to raise them. Our IT colleagues are online to assist. Feel free to use this space to introduce yourselves and tell us where you're joining us from, and I see that everyone's already doing that, so thank you. The Q&A function is a separate feature. It has a little question mark, so hopefully you see that on your screen, on the bottom of your screen. Please use this feature to submit your questions. We will address them at the end of the presentations during the Q&A portion of today's event. Unfortunately, we do not have closed caption translations today, but the report, the Path to Equal report, is translated into Spanish and French. So I encourage you to look at those resources. We'll post them in the chat shortly. And then finally, today's global event is being recorded. The recording and PowerPoint slides will be shared with all participants at the end of the event. Okay, great. So with that, let's begin. Today's discussion centers on the greatest unfinished business of our time, delivering on the promise of gender equality, securing the human rights of women and girls, and ensuring that their fundamental freedoms are fully realized. To do this, we need, among other things, robust measures to assess progress or the lack thereof, right? Today's panel will present the conceptual and technical considerations that informed the construction of UN Women and UNDP's new twin gender indices on women's empowerment and gender equality, and the sobering findings they reveal. The journey from global design to country-specific adaptation will also be covered through UN Women's work in Afghanistan. Additionally, we'll hear from Professor Laurel Walden about the Feminist Mobilization Index, which underscores the critical role women's movements play in driving policy change worldwide. So I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Anne Lohr Humbert. Anne is a professor at the University of Gothenburg and was a senior independent consultant for this project. Anne will share insights on the conceptual framing and our overall thinking around capabilities, around freedoms, and the most relevant domains for constructing these twin indices. Anne, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Jeanette, and what a pleasure to be here. For me, it is late afternoon in Gothenburg in Sweden. I'm going to be opening this webinar by talking a little bit about the work that we have been conducting here, and starting with saying that just like we do recognize as a starting point that the path to equal is something that remains long and uncertain. Have we made progress? Yes, certainly. We have made progress when it comes to gender equality. We see it in terms of education. We see it in the progress that has been made in terms of addressing harmful practices, such as, for example, child marriage and female genital mutilation. We see improvements in maternal health globally, improvements in life expectancy, and thankfully, some improvements in the representation in leadership and public life. We've also seen great mobilization and seen that women and girls globally have been taking a stand in the struggle for racial justice, for the rights of people with disabilities, individuals that come from LGBTIQ plus communities, but also other topics such as climate justice and so on. And yet, we all know that inequalities, gender inequalities in particular, remain. So we still see that women are working less, that they get paid less, and that they are particularly affected by the years in which they have carrying responsibilities. So a great gap between paid work and unpaid work. We see that violence against women and girls remains something that is pervasive, and that gender biased social norms are something that are persisting worldwide. So how did we arrive at the twin index approach? Well, we take the mark from global development frameworks such as the Beijing Platform for Action, but also the work that has been done with the Millennium Development Goal and then the Sustainable Development Goals, which has all shone a light on gender equality as a pressing issue. So all of these frameworks have certainly emphasized the need to have gender-sensitive data, statistics, and indicators, and the need to develop composite indices to monitor progress. And we've seen a great deal of progress made in this area. So some of the different measures that have been created over the last couple of decades by the UNDP, for example, include the Gender Development Index, the Gender Inequality Index, and more recently, the Gender Social Norms Index. And the twin indices for us are responding to the need to complement these measures and together to help answer two fundamental questions. So, for example, are women and girls more empowered to make their own choices and seize opportunities in life? And can we say that gender parity has been achieved? So what I'm going to do in this presentation is give you a brief overview of the key dimensions and indicators that we are using in the twin indices. We start with the life and good health dimension, which is a dimension that reflects the ability and the freedom that all individuals need to have to enjoy life, to have good health, and to have bodily integrity. So the emphasis for us in this dimension is living in good health, as well as living longer, but also focusing on gendered aspect of health and determinants. So thinking about the fact that some of those determinants are biological, and we see from statistics globally that women live longer, but that these additional years are not necessarily in better health, and that women are often sicker in these additional years. In terms of other determinants, we see that many are also related to gender norms. So, for example, risky behaviors linked to masculinities or attitudes towards seeking healthcare that may differ between women and men. So in the twin indices, we are looking at two indicators for the Women's Empowerment Index. One which is modern methods of contraception, which is also an SDG indicator, and the adolescent birth rate. And on the other side, for the Global Gender Parity Index, we are looking at measuring the gender gap in fraction of life in terms of expectancy at birth spent in good health. We also have a dimension that is looking at education, skill building, and knowledge. And for us, this dimension focuses on the importance of education for women's development, for empowerment, their rights, and their opportunities. We chose to adopt two indicators for the Women's Empowerment Index, one being female population with complemented secondary education or higher, recognizing that primary education has been for many countries a topic that has now been addressed when it comes to development. And also focusing on female youth that are not in education, employment, or training, so sometimes abbreviated as NEET, which is also an SDG indicator. And on the other side, in terms of the Global Gender Parity Index, we are looking at indicator measuring gender gaps in population with completed secondary education or higher. Another indicator measuring the gender gap in youth that are not in education, employment, or training. So if you see for all of those dimensions, we try to have, when possible, not always when possible, a complementarity between indicators that are going to take, just in the case of needs, women's or female perspective, and on the other one, it's just a comparison looking at the gender gap between women and men. Our third dimension is that of labor and financial inclusion. And in this dimension, we are recognizing the ability to work for individuals and seeing it as something that is necessary for economic independence. But at the same time, we want this dimension to recognize that care responsibilities and unpaid work more broadly is something that can hinder gender equality in relation to paid work and economic independence. For the Women's Equality Index, what we are looking at is two indicators, one which focuses on the female labor force participation in households of couples that are of prime age, so-called prime age, which is defined statistically as 25 to 54 years, with at least one child under the age of 6. And this indicator is there very much to recognize these care responsibilities that can hinder the ability to participate in paid employment. And then the other indicator is female financial account ownership, recognizing access to financial accounts. Mirroring this for the Global Gender Parity Index, we have an indicator looking at the gender gap in labor force participation among the same prime age household couples, 25 to 54, with at least one child under 6 in the household. And we are looking at the gender gap in financial account ownership as just also an SDG indicator. The next dimension is participation in decision-making. And here we are very much stressing the importance of women's leadership and their ability to make decisions and have a voice in all aspects of activities that are going to affect their lives, their families, and their communities. We recognize that women continue to face a lot of barriers when it comes to political representation and economic leadership. And as such, we felt that it was important to focus on 3 indicators in each of the indices. So for the Women's Empowerment Index, the share of seats in parliament that are held by women, the share of seats in local government held by women, and the share of managerial positions held by women, all of which are also SDG indicators. And for the GGPI, we have the mirror here. We just don't take the share of seats for women, but instead the gender gap in the share of seats held in parliament, held in local government, and held in managerial positions. And then our final dimension is freedom from violence. And we are very happy and proud of this dimension because it has so far been largely neglected in global gender equality measures. And this, as we know, mainly due to challenges with data and indicators. And in the Women's Empowerment Index, we have been able to include an indicator which measures intimate partner violence and its prevalence among ever partnered women and girls, which is also, of course, an SDG indicators. So this gives you a very quick overview of not only the framework that we are using conceptually for the twin indices, but also the indicators that we are using to populate that measurement frameworks. I will let you just read more about this into the report. And in the meantime, I'm going to let my colleague Iñaki tell you a little bit more about how the two indices have been computed.
Great. Thank you so much, Anne. Next, we have Iñaki Permanier. He's a research professor at the Center for Demographic Studies at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Iñaki was also a consultant working with us on this project, a senior consultant. And his presentation will focus on the indicators, of course, but also the computational methodology that underpins the global indices, offering a technical perspective on their development. Over to you, Iñaki.
Okay, thank you, Jeanette. So yeah, thank you so much. I'm just gonna follow where Anne left it, just to explain you a little bit how these different indices and its subcomponents were defined and calculated. And I think the first slide that we had was just this one, where basically it's a replication of the last slide by Anne, where basically we're showing like the different dimensions covered by both indices. Like these global, well, we have different acronym here. It's a previous version, but anyway, the gender gap parity index, it's the first one, and then the women's empowerment measure or women's empowerment index in the other one. So basically we're covering like the same dimensions, but for the first one, for the gender gap index, we have, women and men specific indicators, whereas for the other one, we have women specific ones, right? So let me just go a little bit into more detail into the indicators that we chose and went through the list of indicators. Just let me add that it was really a challenge for the team to find like nice and easy to understand indicators in this line, because there are many restrictions that they should be fulfilled to be included in the list. These indicators, ideally, they should be, easy to grasp, easy to understand, easy to communicate. They should be meaningful. They should have, ideally, like a large, geographical coverage and ideally temporal coverage as well over time. At the same time, we'd like them to be innovative, just, not doing like the recooking, like the same indices as before, but introducing new dimensions. And we should be able to capture like these key dimensions of well-being, right? So these different desiderata, well, typically it's not possible. It's not that easy to find, indicators that fulfill all these restrictions at the same time. So sometimes we found indicators that had like a wide coverage, but then they were difficult to understand, difficult to communicate, or the other way around. So I think in the very end, we found like a nice compromise, and we're pretty happy with the ones that we ended up choosing, right? For example, in this life and good health dimension, and told about this portion of life lived in good health, like this fraction of life that's spent in good health. We found that it gave like a good compromise. It was easy to understand. It captured like this quantity quality trade-off that's often exists in health. And it was pretty, pretty general. It covered like all dimensions of health into a single indicator, because the other options that we had in hand were pretty specific, like suffering like specific disease or having like a coverage for a specific condition or whatever. So it was not that easy, right? And we have tried to be innovative in the list of indicators that we took into consideration. For example, we have looked at this, not only the traditional labor force participation rate, but for example, this labor force participation rate, among couples with children below age 6, which is a nice innovation. Or for example, in the participation and decision-making, we're going beyond like the share of seats held in parliament and go for the local government, which I think is a nice agenda. And also, as Anne was saying, this freedom from violence, we're very happy to having been able to introduce this index in this woman empowerment index, because so far it was not that common to have those kind of measures in the global measure of inequality. So yeah, we're very happy about this one. So how do we compute like both indices, these GGPI and WEI? So basically, we mimic somehow like these methodologies used in in many of these composite indices published before by the United Nations, for example, like the Human Development Index and many other of those composite indices published in the reports. So for example, for the GGPI, this Global Gender Parity Index, so we start creating like the gender gap ratios for each of the indicators. We put the performance of women on top, and then we divide by the performance of men. So in this way, typically it's not necessary to normalize because the units of measurement cancel with each other, and we don't need to normalize as it's going to happen in the next index. And there's a special case of the needs, right? It's a negatively oriented indicator, meaning that the higher the value of this indicator, the worse the outcome, because it's the share of people that it's neither studying nor working. So that's why it should be reversed, and we use like this 100 minus this need, so to be all of them pointing in the same direction. Once we have these for each of these ratios, we create like the specific dimension indices, where basically we are averaging the performance of women over the performance of men. That would be like the second step. And the final one, we need to come up with an aggregate measure of this global gender parity index in step 3, where we're using like the dimension-specific indices using a geometric mean. The reason for using this geometric mean, it's in the last line of this slide, basically it was introduced before like this aggregation methodology in the Human Development Index in a way so that we penalized those distributions that were very, uneven, right? So some countries where they were performing very well in one indicator and very bad in another one. This when, we wanted somehow to not to value those distributions that much, and we wanted to give more, better outcomes for those countries where those indicators were more evenly distributed across domains. That would be for the GGPI. And regarding the Women's Empowerment Index, again, we're following like a similar strategy, but here it's slightly different because here we're just dealing with women-specific indicators, and the normalization procedure is slightly different. So in the previous one, since we were, dividing the outcome of women and men, these units of measurement canceled out. This is no longer the case here. We're just focusing on women-specific indicators, and to make sure that all indicators are bounded between 0 and 1, and then they're pointing in the same direction, we use like the standard, normalization methodology that we are summarizing here in this table. So here we show like the standard procedure of comparing like the actual value of an indicator and compare it with respect to the maximum and minimum possible values that such indicator could take. And depending on whether this indicator is like a positive or negative, positive meaning that the outcome, the higher the outcome, the better, and negative meaning that the lower the outcome, the better. We are using like these normalization formulas in order to make sure that all indicators are bounded between 0 and 1, and that the higher the value, the better the result of the indicator, right? So this is like the standard procedure that was used, for example, in the Human Development Index. So coming back to this aggregation methodology, since once we have completed this first step of normalization, then we have again the second step of dimension index construction. We're averaging using arithmetic means within the different dimensions. So in this case here, we have like, well, you can see the equations here. We have fuller details in the report. And at the end of this step, you have like dimension-specific indices for the 5 different dimensions. And finally, like we did before, we have to aggregate all these dimension index specifically to come up with this Women's Empowerment Index, which is the geometric mean again of the different dimension indices together, right? And again, with the same idea of penalizing those very uneven distributions. We want to, to favor like those other distributions that are more evenly distributed. That would be like the aggregation methodologies used for these 2 indices. And just to wrap up, to conclude, let me just list several of the added values of this composite indices approach. The first one, which I like pretty much, is that we are able to look not only at gender gaps, but also at absolute levels of empowerment, which is something which was not possible before. if we were just using a relative gender gaps measure, it could be the case that, for example, we might observe high levels of gender equality, but at very low levels, of attainment. We can have women and men attaining very low levels of achievement, but because they were equally low, then you have like a high level of parity, right? And using like this twin indices approach, we're able to identify those instances, right? So here I just this is kind of a spoiler of what's going to come up later. Andrea is going to speak about this, but basically we're able to identify countries' performance in these two axes, like the GGPI and the Women's Empowerment Index. So you can locate the different countries depending on whether they have like high parity or high empowerment, or low parity or low empowerment, or all these different combinations, right? So a country where both women and men are performing equally bad, they would have like a high parity, but they would have very low empowerment, right? So we should be able to disentangle like these kind of situations. This is one of the nice things of this twin indices approach, but in top of that, we're also looking at very interesting indicators. We're going, for example, in the health dimension, looking beyond mortality. We're taking into consideration this healthy life expectancy, which is trying to figure out what portion of this life expectancy is spent in good health and compare women with respect to men. We also focused on enhanced capabilities, which is not just basic survival, capabilities, but the enhanced one, which I think it's necessary, in this increasingly unequal world. We're including for the first time proxies of time spent in unpaid care activities, which I think it's pretty innovative in this kind of composite indices of gender inequality. We also included these local government indicators, which again is innovative, also about these gender-based violence, which we're happy about it. And we're also using like this geometric mean aggregation so as to promoting progress on all fronts simultaneously, not just, no favoring like these unbalanced distributions I was alluding to. And well, having said this, I leave the floor to Andrea, who's going to talk to you finally about the results of those indices. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Iñaki. So as Iñaki said, Antra Bhatt is speaking next. She's a statistics specialist at UN Women, and she'll be presenting the final scores and key findings from the global indices, including how these have been received by member states and other constituents, and how we've used the indices to date. Antra, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for handing over to me. I'll just dive in and continue the chain of thought. So I'll just be continuing what Anna and Iñaki have told us about. They've told us about the various indicators and dimensions in the indices, how they've been aggregated, and now we'll just jump into discussing the scores and then the key findings, and also a little bit about what we've done post the launch of these indices as well. Before jumping in, I did want to highlight a few comments that we received when we started this work from various experts in the field who really encouraged us for the approach we took. We were lauded for including a decent number of SDG indicators in the indices, for having two indices that speak to each other at the outset, and the fact that we did have some innovations in there. Iñaki just mentioned some of them in his last slide. Rather than take the conventional route of combining indicators, which traditional indices include, just because they have been widely tested and understood. So we did want to go a step further and do something new and innovative with these indices. The findings from the inaugural release, which happened in 2023, is what we'll focus on for the next few minutes. They are actually quite sobering. We see that globally, women are empowered to achieve on average only 60% of their full potential, as it's measured by the Women's Empowerment Index, the WEI. And if we look at the GGPI, the Global Gender Parity Index, we see that they achieve 72% of what men achieve across key dimensions, across key human development dimensions. That is to say 28% less than what's achieved by men. As you can see on the pointers on this slide, no country has achieved full women's empowerment or complete gender parity, and less than 1% of women and girls live in countries with both high women's empowerment and high performance in achieving gender parity. And most of the world's women and girls, which is 90% of the world's female population, about 3.1 billion, they live in countries that are characterized by low or middle women's empowerment and low or middle performance in achieving gender parity. Actually, this visual that we see here, it's a good pictorial representation of what I just said. It's actually a filled-in version of what Iñaki showed us on his last slide before wrapping up. So he showed us the 4 different quadrants, and now you actually see them with what the data tells you with all of the different colors and everything. So we have these 4 quadrants, and what you will see is that what's really striking is the left bottom quadrant, the biggest one, which is in fact the one that represents 90% of the world's women and girls, the 3.1 billion women and girls. They are the ones who are living in countries that are characterized by low or middle performance on women's empowerment and low or middle performance in achieving gender parity. And then you will see that there are these really small share of women who are living in the context which we would like to be, right? High women's empowerment as well as high score in the gender parity index. So very few there, most of them in this big bucket that you see. And what you'll also see from this chart, you'll also see from this chart is that the sizing of the bubbles. So you will see that you see all the big bubbles are all in that same quadrant. So that's also telling you that some of the world's most populous regions, including Central and Southern Asia, which has India, Eastern Asia and Southeastern Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Northern Africa and Western Asia, they are all falling under this category. So it's really like a nice visual that tells you what's happening in a nutshell in terms of the key findings. What we also see is that because we have done this work not just with the SDG regions, the Sustainable Development Goal regions, but also in collaboration with UNDP, we've looked at how this spans out for the different human development groups, since this was a partnership with them. What we see is that higher human development does not translate into women's empowerment and gender equality one-on-one. In fact, more than 85 countries with a large empowerment deficit and a large gender gap are in the high or very high human development group. 47 countries with low and middle women's empowerment and low and middle gender parity, they fall in the high or very high human development group. So you see that we cannot say that, yes, we have high human development, so automatically that translates into gender equality. That's something that we do not see in the findings from the report. Here is an overview of the scores by dimensions. This is a lot of information, so obviously you'll have to deep dive into it a bit later. But let me just raise a couple of interesting points that one can see from this slide. What's interesting here is that how different the way the Women's Empowerment Index and the GGPI scores are by dimension. So let's pick the education dimension as a whole. What we see is that gender gaps in education are not as large as in some of the other domains. You see that the score is 0.855. That's how in the way that it's captured in the twin indices. And still, despite progress in closing the gender gap in various facets of education, empowerment deficits in this domain are quite large. The score is 0.531. So I think that, yeah, so the score is 0.531, just checking if it was flipping. We can also see that there's large disconnects between progress in basic education and access to secondary or higher education. Something that you don't see here on the slide is that in the report, you will see that apart from just listing out the scores, we also provide you some commentary on why this is it, or is this even happening in terms of like the qualitative arguments and stuff. So we also see that in many least developed countries, for example, the LDC classification, less than 5% of women aged 25 and older have completed secondary education or higher. So while we are hearing this whole narrative about globally rates of women enrolled and even completing secondary education to be very high overall, we do see that as you disaggregate the data further, there are pockets where you see a lot of deprivation still. And one example is the one that I just pointed out. The other is conflict countries. So in conflict and post-conflict countries and contexts, more than 2/3 of young women and girls are not in education, employment, or training. So I think this just gives you an additional flavor on how the scores look and why they are looking in a certain way. Staying with the same education domain, let's take the example of education outcomes when we look at them across the SDG regions. So Northern Africa and Western Asia, it's close to parity, as you can see. So as you can see from this chart, the completion rates for women and for men are quite similar. But just like the parity scores that you see for Australia and New Zealand, right, the ratio seems to be very similar. The level of achievements, though, is very different across the regions. So what you see is that the proportion of women and girls 25 and older who have completed secondary education or higher is 78.4% in Australia and New Zealand, compared to 45.1% in Northern Africa and Western Asia. So this is why we wanted to have two different indices, one that is also telling you what the levels of empowerment are and not just what the gender gaps are. This also tells us that we need to analyze women's empowerment in tandem with gender parity, and both are essential to obtain a complete picture of both issues, especially in different geographic regions and even by levels of human development. Based on these findings, we don't just, again, list out the scores and tell you what they are. We also propose 5 areas where policy action is urgently needed. As you know, we're already in 2024, almost towards the end, and we only have 6 years left to achieve the SDGs. So we also wanted to make a call to action for what's really needed. So we've essentially focused on a few areas. Firstly, health policies that must recognize the different needs of women and men across the life cycle and support and promote long and healthy lives for all. Also, being vocal about universal access to sexual and reproductive health that must be fully integrated into national development strategies, including through rollout of family planning programs. Equality in access to education and learning must go beyond parity. We're saying that more efforts are needed to reach the most marginalized women and girls so that parity is achieved. And addressing gaps in skills and quality of education in science and STEM fields and through digital learning is really important. We're also saying that greater investment is needed in policies that address the unpaid care and domestic work imbalance, recognizing the economic value of unpaid care work, investing in access to affordable, quality childcare services, and implementing parental leave schemes, flexible working arrangements, and so on and so forth. We also need more efforts to support women's equal participation across all levels and spheres of public life. And we're also arguing for focus on prevention, changing social norms, eliminating discriminatory laws and policies. And also we need to confront violence against women and girls. And these actions are really aimed at bringing about normative and structural shifts, which coupled with other multi-sectoral investments are really vital for delivering on the promises of the Beijing Declaration, but also the platform for action. I'll just now pull up one quick slide on the reception to date and what we've done after the launch, and then I'm almost done. But in terms of how the indices have been used so far, so first of all, we officially launched the indices in collaboration with UNDP. This took place in 2023 at the Women Deliver Conference in Kigali, Rwanda. Again, to let you know that the results and findings are based on 114 countries only, because that was the sample for which we could include data based on data availability for all indicators. So we could create the indices. The report itself that we launched is available in English, Spanish, and French, and a lot of the associated materials with the report as well, so that we could reach a wider variety of policymakers and audiences. Since the launch, we have organized a lot of regional and country briefings on the topic with our country offices, UN Women country offices, and UNDP has done the same. And based on these efforts, I think we see 2 concrete wins that I would like to highlight. One is that we see a lot of interest in doing this work at the national and subnational level, and 3 concrete examples of countries who will be doing national companions of this work are India, Indonesia, and Afghanistan. In fact, we have Michelle with us today who will talk more about the work in Afghanistan. The other win is that we have had a lot of countries reach out to us to know why they were not included in this edition of the report and what they can do to be included, which we take as a win, because that means that they want to work with us to fill up those critical data gaps at the national level. And these indices are in some way an impetus for that, with the majority of the indicators and the indices being SDG indicators. This means better data for the SDGs as well. So I think those concrete wins, and hopefully more to come in the time. As I wrap up, let me just leave you with some details on how you can access the report. I know we're also going to share the PowerPoint. You can download the report on either UN Women's webpage or UNDP HDRO's webpage. Both URLs are here, QR code is here. And I know we'll be circulating the deck, so you'll also have access to the deck. Feel free to also get in touch with any of us, all the presenters and Jeanette, for the comments on thoughts that you may have on the first edition. And with that, I think that's my time. I look forward to engaging in a discussion with you all after the presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Antra. Following Antra, we have our 4th panelist, Michelle Garrick. She's a program specialist at UN Women in our country, in the country office in Afghanistan. Michelle will discuss Afghanistan's unique experience and the challenges and opportunities of implementing these measures in fragile contexts. Michelle, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Jeanette. It's a privilege to join you all here today at this webinar. I think this event comes at a really pivotal moment. I think many countries around the world are grappling with really profound gender challenges. And speaking to you from Kabul, I think I can say that Afghan women are currently facing one of, if not the world's worst women's rights crisis. And from this baseline, we're working to contextualize and apply the twin indices. So we've framed this as the Afghanistan Gender Index. And this is based on data collection done in March this year. We were able to update a number of indicators and are due to publish the final report next month. So I'd just like to take a moment to situate the context of global efforts towards women's empowerment and gender parity. When we look through the prism of Afghanistan, you can really see what is at stake here. I think no doubt most of you have heard piecemeal about the situation in Afghanistan for women and girls, but I'd like to take a moment to lay it out fully, or a little bit more than piecemeal. Currently, women and girls can't go to school beyond grade 6. That's 11 years of age, roughly. Women are unable to work in many sectors. They're banned from working in the UN, at NGOs, in the civil service. Women's salaries are capped at around $70 per month, US. The impact of restrictions to education and employment include a decline in women's influence in the household, an increase in household financial stress, reported links to increases in domestic violence, increases in child and forced marriage, and long-term, a reduction in the skills and experience that are needed for leadership positions and political participation. In August this year, many of you might have heard that a law was passed to tighten restrictions further. This is called the Morality Law. This bans women from taking public and private transport, buses, taxis, private cars, without a male guardian or wearing a full hijab or body and face covering. It also bans women's voices in public spaces. It forbids women and men from looking at each other if they aren't closely related. And it forbids Muslim women from interacting with non-Muslim women. It also gives morality police and male community members broad-ranging powers to ensure compliance with this and other laws. The effect on women and girls beyond the obvious is that many no longer leave the home unless it's absolutely necessary. Mental health issues are anecdotally skyrocketing, and desire for migration among well-educated Afghans is continuing to increase. So on top of this, programming is also targeted by the Taliban, which bans programming that targets women and girls as main beneficiaries. NGOs can't have the word women or gender in their name. Women are officially banned from working at NGOs, as I mentioned, and raids of NGO offices and detention of staff are commonplace. So this is the context in which we are applying the twin indices. We chose these indices as a comprehensive way to unpack the totality of women's experience and the opportunities and barriers for progress towards gender equality in Afghanistan, and also as a way to ensure what should be progress, but unfortunately is actually regress in this context, can be monitored over time to avoid a moving baseline, so to speak, and to situate Afghanistan globally. Although we could not update every indicator with our own data collection due to the restrictions in the current circumstances, we were able to update many, and using secondary data as well as primary qualitative data, we could develop a holistic picture of where things stand. So in terms of the methodology, we used a multi-stage sample. This was implemented due to the lack of well-defined population size at each stage. We allocated 256 interviews to each region across 8 regions recognized by the UN for a total of 2,048 interviews, and that was divided equally among men and women. We chose 2 provinces per region, and within each province, 4 districts were selected, and that was at a ratio of 1 urban and 3 rural districts to reflect the proportions of the country. And from there, the last 2 stages, we selected villages and households through a random walkthrough approach with a right-hand rule. The data was collected through door-to-door surveys, and our enumerators faced very specific challenges in this context. We needed sufficient female enumerators to be able to reach women. In Afghanistan, a man couldn't come to the door and speak to an unrelated woman. It was only possible for women enumerators to speak to women at the door, and these women enumerators had to work with a mahram or male relative to escort them to conduct this data collection. Enumerators also faced safety concerns from the Taliban, and this limited the duration of the survey that we were able to put in place. The size of the survey had to be limited, and despite not being able to update things like life and good health dimension, we actually had to use many questions related to health to ensure that we led with a less sensitive topic than some of the other questions and areas of focus in the twin indices. Accessing and discussing women and girls was also very difficult to do this safely. Cultural norms mean that enumerators cannot ask about certain topics, so things like gender-based violence and sexual and reproductive health were not possible to discuss. And enumerators can neither ask about nor speak directly to adolescent girls and young women aged roughly 13 to 18 or so. So this means that some indicators, which would normally be measured from the age of 15 plus in our data collection, had to be measured from a higher age. The surveys were also supplemented by a large qualitative component to really explain and contextualize and nuance the results of these indicators. We measured the following indicators through our data collection. Our data collection is not published yet. It comes out at the end of this month or start of next month. So I'll be walking you through the results of these indicators verbally. So firstly, the DFA, the Taliban bans on girls and women's education beyond primary school, has essentially created a pathway where, if left unchecked, the overall secondary school completion rate for women will drop to 0. Even now, what we saw was that the rate of women is less than half of men. So women's secondary school completion rate sits at 12% in comparison to men's at 29%. The systematic nature of the bans on women's education, their restrictions to their employment, is really seen in the rate of young women currently not in education, employment, or training. So in 2024, young women stand at 78% compared to 20% of young men who are not currently in education, employment, or training. Women's participation in the labor force is also markedly lower than that of men's. In 2024, this stands at 24% compared to 89% among men, with many women unemployed and seeking jobs in that 24%, and those women who do actually work, they often are employed in lower paid and less secure positions. Afghan women also rank low in their access to financial resources. In 2024, only 7% of women had a bank account or had used a moneylender in comparison to 20% of men. So that is low overall across both men and women, but particularly low among women. Lastly, the Taliban have wholly erased women's political participation and representation. So this is most clearly seen here by a score of 0 in these two indicators for this dimension. Seats held in local government and in the national parliament. The latter we measured in the current context by proxy as positions held by women in the central de facto cabinet. This total absence of women's representation in all levels of governance not only silences their voices, but hinders progress towards gender parity. So Afghan women are denied the opportunity to shape the policies affecting their lives and communities, and the policies that could improve their outcomes in all of these dimensions that we're talking about here. So what are we aiming to do and get towards in terms of impact with these gender index? So in contexts like Afghanistan, these indices offer more than just data points. They center the full experiences of Afghan women. They make visible what might otherwise remain hidden. So these metrics really allow us to spotlight and track the lived realities of women and girls in a context where they're quite literally being erased. In line with this, it also encourages gender-responsive economic and social growth. So these indices show us a comprehensive and complex overview of Afghan women's lives. When we look at the dimensions in silos, which often happens, I think, when we're working in specific areas, so within the UN system, within international organizations, we really risk only seeing part of the story. And in reality, and through this gender index and the twin indices, we can see how different indicators are actually really closely intertwined. So this is critical for gender responsive policymaking. And nowhere do we see that more than in Afghanistan. And is that more important in Afghanistan when you look at something like governance, where you have 0 women in local or higher level political decision-making positions? You can also get a sense for how that links with legislative equality and how that links to health outcomes, for example. We see clearly how employment links to decision-making power and political participation, as well as domestic violence, or how girls' secondary school education links to essentially all outcomes in all other indicators. This also aims to contribute to data-driven diplomacy, policymaking, and resource allocation. So in a context of extreme need and limited political capital and media attention, these indicators can spotlight gaps and provide a clear picture of where resources and diplomatic efforts are needed. The full scope of dimensions also helps us to support advocacy efforts that spotlight issues that are politically compelling for the Taliban, for example, or for the international community, which can really change quite quickly at any given time. And it can also support the tracking of progress and accountability on women's rights. So in Afghanistan, we've seen an extremely alarmingly fast regression of women's rights and freedoms, which, despite how horrific it is, can actually, in fact, be quite difficult to track and to fully absorb. So these indicators are comparable over time and comparable globally, which can provide a really critical form of documentation and accountability. And together, it aims to prevent crises like Afghanistan's from slipping off the global agenda. So as we move forward, I would really encourage all of us to think about how these tools can be applied more widely. What we see is that the individual stories behind the data of the women who are barred from education, from employment, these stories demand our response and the application of tools like this. I think as policymakers, we can use these indices to shape inclusive policies. As advocates, they can use these to employ them to amplify women's voices. And I think, as we've already seen in the last three presenters, as researchers, you can continue to innovate to ensure that no woman is left behind in this context. So with that, Jeanette, I will pass back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Such important work. Finally, we will hear from Professor Laurel Walden of Simon Fraser University, who will present the Feminist Mobilization Index. Laurel will highlight how women's movements have influenced policy changes worldwide and what this means for the broader push towards gender equality. Laurel, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Jeanette, and thank you for organizing this inspirational and meaningful session. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to speak to everyone. It's a great honor and really such great work. It's so exciting to see. I want to begin by joining Jeanette in acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, which are named here in this land acknowledgement by Simon Fraser University, which is SFU and the university with which I am associated. And I would like to greet you in the language of one of these Coast Salish peoples in the spirit of reconciliation, and to say Hatsquail Tanuyup to you in the language of the Squamish people, one of these people on whose territories I'm located. So I want to change gears a little bit from talking about what outcomes there are and what gender inequalities and gender injustices we're tracking with all these incredibly important measures that we've seen, these really brave and important and careful and rigorous measures, to talking about what women are doing around the world in reaction to gender justice, gender injustice, and gender inequality. And, I'm sure we can all, each of us who are on this call, think of something where we can think of an instance of how women have responded. One that comes to mind for me is thinking about how about a decade ago, French women walked out to protest wage gaps. And they were inspired by a similar protest in Iceland. And there's a lot of cross-national learning, which hopefully today will be an example of. Women are organizing to support each other in their economic endeavors, to develop businesses, to develop some income all around the world. Women are organizing in these various ways to support each other. This is a really important force for change. And so if we are interested in understanding gender justice, we want to be able to track, women's efforts to make their own lives better as well. And so to this end, I led a team that tried to measure feminist mobilization. And we developed something called the Feminist Mobilization Index. And I'm going to talk to you about that briefly now. This Feminist Mobilization Index, and I'll just give you a very broad overview, and I'm happy to discuss the details, measures the existence, strength, and autonomy of feminist movements. And one of the reasons for doing this is to try to see, well, how do women organize over time around the globe, so we can see the impact on some of these different dimensions that Anne and others have been discussing. And the index looks at both the existence of this measure. At one point, it's just to saying, do you even have a feminist movement at all? And it tracks it all the way along to the most strong, independent feminist movements. And so it's a measure of both. It starts with the measure of mere existence and moves to a strong and autonomous movement. And the formula is just kind of a dummy variable for those of you who are methods geeks, a dummy variable for existence plus a variable that multiplies strength by autonomy of the movement. And I'm happy to give you more details on this. And at the end, I have some publications that summarize some of those details for you that you can look at as well. So why did we bother doing this? Well, we knew going into this project that feminist movements have been critical for advances in gender justice around the world. We have already lots of examples and case studies and global analyses that show that feminist movements are critical for advances in areas of gender justice, such as violence against women, family law, reproductive rights, women's legal status at work, marriage equality, land tenure, childcare. And why do they matter? How do they make a difference? Well, one important thing, and this goes to what we just heard about Afghanistan, is that movements articulate women's perspectives. They transform public opinion, and they insert issues into public and policy agendas that would not otherwise be considered. They resist rollbacks, right? They try to prevent rollbacks in women's rights. So this is a very important element. And in some ways, we want to be thinking about indirect effects as well. Sometimes feminist movements demand, procedural changes or institutional changes, the creation of women's commissions, the development of gender's data, like we were just talking about today. And these things can have indirect or, difficult to identify effects as well. Okay, so the index that we developed, as I mentioned, varies from 0 to 3. It's got these categories, and we tried to use, you know, something that captured meaningful variation, but wasn't too, hadn't have false refinement. So this was our effort at trying to get at these big global differences where we're comparing a lot of different contexts over time, 120 countries over 4 decades. I was struck by the remark from the researchers that they only did 114 countries, which is quite a lot of countries. I know it leaves many countries out, but it is quite a lot of work. So here in this measure for the Feminist Mobilization Index, the lowest score is those countries where there really isn't any evidence at all of autonomous feminist mobilization. And we gave a 1 to those countries where there might be a feminist movement existing, but we don't see much evidence of being autonomous. It's not commanding a lot of public attention. Those autonomous and strong feminist movements are those where the movement is independent of male-dominated organizations and also can command public attention. And I'm happy to say more about that if there's questions. So if you actually look at this data over at 5 data points over 4 decades, here is a kind of a picture of what you see happening. And let me show this to you one other way. Which basically shows you that over time, strong and autonomous feminist movements have been strengthening. They've been spreading around the world, increasing in intensity, more globally pervasive. It shows us what we probably feel in our lives if we've been around for 50 years or so, which is that there's an increasing presence of feminism around the globe, and it's increasingly strong. I'm sorry. And I probably don't need to tell this to you today, especially after our presentation on Afghanistan, but other world events as well remind us that even though there's been such tremendous progress and it's been an incredible force, feminism has been an incredible global force, that it's not just unidirectional. There can be, feminist movements wax and wane. They get stronger, they get weaker. And, we see some countries moving in and out of different categories over time, and those movements become less autonomous, they become absorbed into government, they lose their political vitality, they're repressed, they're eliminated. Lots of things happen that make these movements wax and wane over time in terms of strength. And also, even if we see a kind of global force for spread and in great increasing intensity, it doesn't mean that in every country or in every region, the same pattern obtains. So this just shows you a regional difference, but if we looked at by countries, it would be, even more diverse. But this shows you that, you see at the very beginning of this period, feminist mobilization is declining in West Europe, but increasing in most other regions. In East Asia, it's a little bit more flat at the beginning. So you can see that in each of these regions, there's a different pattern. We're on a different cycle. It's not the case that everybody's on the same trajectory. So that's important for us to remember as well, that there's a lot of different kind of global trajectories here. So even though, as I said, feminist mobilization is intensifying and increasingly widespread globally, looking from 75 to 2015, which is what this data set covers, we see that there's increasing autonomy and strength of movements. We also see, as I'll show you more in a minute, if I have time here, that these kinds of movements are very closely linked to democracy, and they are negatively associated or kind of work in opposition. They seem to develop in opposition to authoritarianism, particularly a variety of kind of communist authoritarianism. There are regional and global influences and patterns that are distinct around the world that have different effects, but also are important. And also, I wanted to just underline that when we're talking about feminist mobilization and the challenge of measuring it, we are not looking at a single organization. So sometimes people will say, oh, this doesn't sound like an organization that I know. But the point is not to look at a single organization, but try to capture a kind of macro level picture of a country and ask, what is the broad force of organizations that work together. So it might not be one organization, it might be a multiple organizations, including activists that are not in an organization at all, which is often the case for feminists, or are participating online or are doing other kinds of things. The kinds of protests that we see are not always accompanied by formal organization. So if we look at this regional, I showed you these regional patterns that are quite different, just in terms of thinking about why are some regions characterized by really high levels of feminist mobilization and others aren't. Why do they decline? Why do they increase? We looked at some things that seemed like they were kind of jumpstarting or sparking greater feminist mobilization. In general, these regional networks that we saw were resources for women in the region and helped strengthen country level efforts. But also, those regional networks themselves were strengthened when a place hosted a UN meeting. It seemed to help sort of build, probably because of all the prep comms and those kinds of things, brought women together, gave them a chance to work together, gave them a chance to share information. Also, when there's greater democratization, no surprise, right? You have the opportunity to speak out and articulate, women's perspectives. As I mentioned, this is this is both something that sparks feminist mobilization, and feminists also tend to demand greater transparency and openness. So there's this very tight relationship. And where there had been a prevalence of a communist rule or legacy, a communist authoritarianism here I'm talking about in particular, it made it very difficult. It had kind of a long-term effect on a civil society and made it difficult for women to organize in civil society as independent from government. Okay. So just to kind of make this point another way, these are just correlations or associations showing you that the Feminist Mobilization Index is strongly positively correlated with democracy and negatively correlated with authoritarianism, negatively correlated with communism or communist legacy, and that women's participation in civil society organizations, this is women's participation, not just feminist organizations, is strongly associated with this Feminist Mobilization Index, and that in general, repression of civil society organizations, and we're talking about reverse coding equally here, is repression of civil society organizations is negatively associated with feminist mobilization. So, this is just kind of making this broader point that I was saying about democratic openness, authoritarianism, and feminism. There are close relationships here. So I'll try to wrap up here, and I just want to make a couple of comments to conclude. Mobilization in movements is distinct from, but related to, mobilization in formal organizations only, or lobbying, being elected to office, or being online activity. All of these things can be part of feminist organizations, but we really need to track feminist mobilization as a distinct measure of political life because it is related to advances in many of the areas that we were just talking about. And even though this is a very difficult to measure phenomenon, I don't want to make it sound like it's very easy. It's a very important thing to measure. We're taking a kind of macro level look is also important because sometimes we can say, oh, this organization didn't succeed, or this new organization is formed. And those things can be relevant, but we don't want to associate a movement with necessarily with a particular person or organization, although of course they're not completely separable. And I guess the reason this measure focuses on autonomy, I just want to also emphasize, is because that is what the research emphasizes is really important for creating political will to drive major change in women's rights. So when we want major changes, big changes, and I'm not talking about incremental changes, bigger changes in women's rights, these autonomous or independent feminist organizations can drive change in male-dominated institutions and in male-dominated societies. I think I've said enough there about how feminist mobilization changes over time, and how feminist movements can become weak or grow to be stronger. And we still need so much work to do to track the causes of changes in and impacts of feminist mobilization. But we've been really excited to be able to start that work, and we're hoping to maybe update this index. And we have had some conversations about trying to update it to find out what's been going on in the last decade. So thank you very much. Oh, and I should say this is just a questions thing, but there's also, this is the one data set paper on this. This describes the data set, links to the data set. This paper in International Studies Quarterly with my co-authors, who are some current and former students. Now they're all fancy professors at different places. And there are some other papers as well that outline some of the findings about democracy. This one is talking about how feminism develops around the world, and this one talks about looking at autonomy as a feature of global feminist organization. And this one talks about feminism and women's economic rights. And there's a lot of research on feminism and violence against women. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laurel. The emojis are now working. We were having some technical difficulties, but as you see, lots of emojis, positive emojis and comments from our audience to all the panelists. So thank you all for your very powerful and insightful presentations. We will now open the floor for questions. There's actually quite a number of questions already on the chat, but if you haven't done so yet, feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function. And we'll do our best to address as many as possible. We're short on time, but we're going to turn to the Q&A straight away. I saw that there was a question that I'm going to direct to Antra about the cutoff points for the 4 categories that we created, and also a question about data, where to find the data. So Antra, if you wanted to take that, those 2 questions. And did we lose Antra? No, there she is. Okay.
I'm here. Sorry, the control is a little bit was acting up. But yeah, happy to take those questions, and I've also tried to answer some others that are in the Q&A because I know we won't have so much time. But yeah, on the cutoffs, I did want to say that what we did was we tried to look at both indices together, the GGPI and the weight, and it's actually we looked at the distribution of the GGPI first at the different quartiles. So that 0.8, which is actually 0.799, is the point which is the topmost quartile of scores from the GGPI. And that's where we cut the 0.8 from. So you will see that what we do is that less than 0.6 is low performance in GGPI, 0.6 to 0.699 is lower middle performance, 0.7 to 0.799 is upper middle, and then 0.8 onwards is high performance. And then what we do is we try to maintain the same levels for the way as well, because then that way we can have that really nice quadrant that tells you how we are doing in terms of in a tandem, right? Like how the 2 indices are doing together. So that's how the quartiles were sort of cut. I know there were 2 questions that kind of touched upon this. This is also included in the statistical annex for the inside the report, so you will be able to see this information there. The other question about the data I saw was on the different secondary data sources, the timelines and all of that. So you will see that in the annex tables for the report, we do have a specific cutoff point only beyond which we include the data. So we ensure that we're not including 2 data points, that one is from 2000 and the other is from 2010. So we do ensure that first of all, we take the latest available year, which is available, but that also we cut off beyond a certain year as well to ensure that we're taking data that are not dated at all. Was there another question, Jeanette, that...
No, I think
okay.
in interest of time, that's great. Thank you so much, Antra. We have a technical note that goes into more detail. So we'll try to look for that and put that on the chat as well, if we haven't done so already. And I wanted to turn it over to you and then maybe also Michelle. There's been some questions around how to use these indices to inform policy. One question was about how to use these indices to inform policy action in high-income countries like Sweden. So I thought, Anne, maybe you wanted to take a shot at that. And then Michelle, maybe you can talk a little bit more about some of the programming work that we're doing in Afghanistan. So maybe over to you, Anne, first, and then Michelle.
Yes, thank you, Jeanette. So I do work in Sweden, but I've only been here for 6 months. So I would not say that I am an expert necessarily on Sweden. But what is very interesting about living here is this perception that it is a country that has achieved gender equality. And I have to say that it feels that in many ways it has, and yet people keep talking to me about, oh, but there are problems here and there. In the twin indices, what I think is really interesting is that no matter what the scores are, we need to remember that there is room for improvement. That there is, even in a country like Sweden that is scoring very, very high relative to other countries, and here probably Afghanistan is going to be towards the bottom and Sweden towards the top. it still doesn't mean that everything has been achieved. And we really need to pay attention in all countries, Sweden included, to gender norms, to stereotypes, and to not making regressions. Because even in a country like Sweden and many others in which I've lived and worked, I think that I am worried. I am worried that the trends could reverse. So my policy recommendations would be to try and not celebrate the high score so much, but to actually think about what else are we not measuring, where are the remaining inequalities, and how do we help everybody, all women, all girls globally, make progress towards just greater gender equality generally.
Thank you, Anne. Michelle, did you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. I think here it's a particularly difficult situation in terms of informing policy. Where you would normally speak to a government to try to inform policy, here we're mainly engaging the international community, so UN, INGOs, people who are doing programming work on the ground, and trying to support these actors in doing data-driven and evidence-informed programming that is gender responsive. What we're also trying to do is find advocacy messaging that is compelling for the Taliban authorities. So I think something that I touched on briefly in my presentation is that the wide scope of dimensions that are being covered by the twin indices are really useful in finding, in allowing for the creation of different types of advocacy messages, and also for bringing together all of the different programming topics and trying to see the situation from quite a broad scope, and quite a, to really understand the intertwined nature of the different dimensions and indicators. As UN Women, what we're trying to do is work on data collection and informing key policy windows and making sure Afghan women's voices are heard in those policy windows. This is one way that we're trying to compensate for the lack of women's political participation and the general silencing of women's voices. So this is a really key element of what we would call a women, peace and security agenda that is being contextualized to a context where you can't engage with a government authority. So this is a really, really important element of our women, peace and security work, actually, in this specific context. I'll stop there, knowing that we don't have so much time.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. Iñaki, over to you. There was a question about using these indices to look at inequalities within countries. And I know the answer to that, but I wanted to turn it over to you. So over to you, Iñaki, for maybe some responses and thoughts on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeanette. Yeah, I mean, we were experimenting to create the estimates of these indices at the subnational level. And ideally, well, you could do this analysis for the countries with the necessary data, but in the end, we didn't include those analyses because I don't remember, Antra, how many countries we ended up estimating, but well, I don't know. So the issue is that at some point we might want to publish those things. The only constraint is about data availability. But it's not always possible to have like this highly detailed information. If I remember correctly, we did the analysis by wealth quintiles or something like that. So we were replicating like the values of these way index for five groups, if I remember correctly. But do you remember, Antra, how many countries? I don't know.
Yeah, about like less than 80 countries, and we had to deal with a lot of time series issues as well.
Right, yeah, it was an experimental thing, but the takeaway message was that there were big gaps. I mean, it's not that it was representative that as soon as you start, looking at wealth quintiles, there was a much more inequality that was uncovered, which was a very interesting finding. Yeah, and ideally, I guess if you perform this analysis everywhere, it's going to show up, yeah, everywhere.
Thank you. So something we definitely are looking into for future editions of the report, because it's actually really quite powerful to show the parallel inequalities that we see across countries, also being evident within countries as well. Laurel, there was a question, and sorry to put you and Anne on the spot, because I'm not sure if we ended up doing this, but there was a question about the correlations between the global gender indices and your index. And so I know we wanted to potentially look at that, but I'm not sure if we did in the end. So over to you, Laurel, and then maybe Anne, if you wanted to jump in on that question as well. We did do some correlations with other indices. And so maybe, Anne, if you recall, we can also touch on that. We looked at the correlation of these indices with other indicators and indices, including the Women Business in the Law Index and an indicator under the SDG framework, or an index under the SDG framework that looks at laws and policies to promote gender equality, right? So looking at the correlation between outcomes and processes. But Laurel, over to you.
Well, no, I didn't do, I don't know if Anne did, but I didn't have a chance to do that analysis in the last little while, but I'm very excited to do it. And this is amazing, amazing data work that your team has done and that you've done in this report. It's just incredible. And I just am so impressed, and I'm really looking forward to looking at it. I do think that it's interesting to have both an aggregate and the ability to aggregate and disaggregate these dimensions, because I think my research suggests to me that you'll find quite different relationships between certain kinds of outcomes and autonomous feminist mobilization. And there might be some things where electing women to government is more important, like generous maternity leave, for example, or something like that. But but I think in general, you're going to find that there's a positive relationship. Looking at the other similar kinds of indicators, like the gender empowerment measure or some of these other measures that the UN has created over time, they're definitely positively related to feminist mobilization. And I think I have I'm trying to think of whether they're included in some of the analyses that I presented, including that ISQ article that I mentioned. There's a little bit of research there on democracy and feminism. And I think there's I can't remember if it ended up being too long for that paper, but we did some work on gender attitudes and things like that too. But that's a long way of saying it's a research agenda, and I'm excited to talk to Anne more about it. I don't know if she wants to add anything. She's amazing, so she's probably already on.
I haven't had time to do it, but challenge accepted. I think Laura and I can get our heads together and just try and compute that. And as you know, I'm a huge fan of the Feminist Mobilization Index, so it would be with great pleasure to actually see what we can do by combining the two.
Wonderful. Great to see some potential collaborations already coming out of this event. I want to also acknowledge that Gunzeli Berek, who's a senior consultant as well that we worked with on this project, who actually wrote the conceptual framing paper that kicked us off, is on the call and has made some really great comments and suggestions on the chat. So Gunzeli, so lovely to have you here, and a big thank you for your contribution to this work. Gunzeli is actually asking about whether we could include some of the work that Laurel is doing in future editions of the index. And so wanted to maybe ask all of you if are there areas or domains that you think we should definitely consider including in the next editions. We see this very much as kind of an experimental set of indices at the moment, with the idea to increase more indicators and possibly new domains. And so, of course, in the report, we highlighted some that we know we missed and would have loved to have seen, but maybe as a kind of concluding set of questions, are there areas that are key to gender equality and women's empowerment that you all would like to see us do more to expand the data, country coverage, and hopefully include in future editions of the indices? Maybe I'll turn that question to everyone and maybe use that to wrap up. So Antra, do you want to come first?
Sorry, my computer is a little bit slow. Yeah, I guess you've said all of it, Jeanette. The floor is open to the others, because I guess you've already given great comments, so nothing additional from my side.
Laurel, over to you, particularly based on the work that you've done. You've already highlighted a few things, but over to you for any other thoughts.
Yeah, I think the data, the kind of intensive nature of the research to create these indices makes it difficult to include it for every country for every year, as your team has found with so many indicators. But I do think that one of the things that is possible is to kind of validate some proxies that could be used. And I'm thinking about like measures of women's organizations that they aren't the same, and you'd have to be, it's a little tricky, but I think that, you might be able to do something at least general. But, so anyway, yes, I think it would be great to include a measure, and happy to brainstorm about that with somebody if they want.
Wonderful. Michelle, did you want to come on this
Yeah,
question?
I mean, I don't have ideas for something new. I think I will leave that to the researchers on the team here. But I just want to say how vital and useful such a clear framework and the way that the twin indices were framed was for somebody like me coming from a UN Women office in Afghanistan and working with teams on the ground and trying to really, essentially what we're trying to do is develop compelling storytelling as well as monitoring indicators and the status of women and girls and men as well, at gender parity. So having this kind of framework was incredibly useful, and also to build more nuanced data collection into this framework. So just really thank you very much for all of your wonderful work.
Thank you, Michelle. There was another question that actually got 3 upvotes about backlash. And I have to say that is what we were expecting, right? So for UN Women, this was, and I'm not speaking for UN Women because I'm currently on sabbatical, but from my experience while I was there, we were expecting a backlash and we didn't see that, honestly. In fact, we actually saw the reverse. Countries who are not included in the inaugural issue wanted to know why and can they fill those gaps so they can be included in future editions. Indonesia was an example that Ansha gave, who's currently adapting their methodology within the national statistical system to collect that data at the kind of sub-regional level themselves and report it themselves and use it as a tool within the national context to monitor their progress on gender equality and women's empowerment. So just to answer that question, but over to you, Iñaki. Any thoughts on things we should be looking at and innovating for future editions?
Oh, thank you so much. Very difficult question. I don't know. I think I don't have an answer now, but my experience is that typically it's very difficult to include these new dimensions because we had a hard time, to consolidate the ones that we finally presented because of those constraints I spoke about, right? Because since we want to be, having like this wide global coverage, perhaps what's meaningful in Sweden is not meaningful, in Uruguay or in Botswana. And that's the difficulty, I guess, right? But of course, I mean, it's always like a research agenda and always looking forward for that. But currently, yeah, I don't know. I don't have like a good answer to that. But yeah, I'm thinking it's always, like in new waves, and definitely we should incorporate like new ideas and the new versions.
Thank you, Iñaki. And you have the last word. Did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I think we all know there are challenges with including new dimensions, and there are many we could talk about: climate change and the rise of digital platforms, just thinking about digitalization. I think what we haven't mentioned, and which is also very much constrained by the availability of data, statistics, and indicators, is what we need to do in terms of intersectionality. Because here we're not able to provide enough of a breakdown. What is the situation for people in rural and urban areas? What is the situation for people of different ages? Just what do we see in terms of the situation for people with disabilities and so on? And how do we just say something more? And this is just, I'm not going to have any answers to this, but I think we should use these indices as a platform to start having debates and call for greater disaggregation and granularity in the data that we have so that we can have better policies that are more inclusive.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I think we're going to wrap up now. We're out of time. We're actually over time, I think. I'll very quickly maybe emphasize a few key takeaways from today's event. I think our discussion covered the strength of indices, the power of these indices, but also, of course, that there's always room for improvement, as we just heard. And it's also really important to think about their practical applications, right, across different contexts, including to drive policy action. I think we heard, and I think it's important to highlight that higher human development alone is insufficient to empower women and girls and bring about gender equality. Progress in gender equality is not necessarily linear, is something that I also heard, and requires continued advocacy and agitation. A national, regional, and global commitment to data, evidence, and knowledge on women's status and well-being is critical for advancing the agenda of women's empowerment and gender equality. We can't treasure what we don't measure. And I think part of the reason why it was kind of difficult for those who were with us during this 2-year process to highlight what we should include in future editions is that we know very well the limitations with the data, and so really important to continue to advocate for better and more robust gender data. We also heard from Professor Weldon that movements are diffuse and difficult to measure phenomena that compromise various forms of mobilization, from in-person to online, et cetera, networking, protesting, lobbying, but hugely important. Autonomous feminist organizations, independent of government, and male-dominated organizations are vital for setting a feminist policy agenda. The discussion has highlighted the value and need for robust and diverse tools. I think that was the power of today's presentation, hearing from the work of Professor Weldon and the potential correlations and links with some of this other work that we've done. And we need more of this, right, to drive tangible progress towards gender equality. Before we conclude, I'd like to thank UBC for co-hosting this event and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs for their support. If you're considering further studies in public policy, I highly recommend looking into their programs. The same goes for practitioners, right? Many of you on the call today considering a research sabbatical. I have loved my time here. So the link to the school and its offering is posted on the chat. And please join me in a resounding round of applause or applause emojis, as you already are doing, to the team that made this event possible, including the SPPGA events and communications team, the IT staff, Chris and Riley, and our 2 brilliant student coordinators from the SPPGA program, Elena and Ilaha. Huge thanks. We would not have had this event if it wasn't for your support. As we've said repeatedly, I think in the chat, the recording of today's webinar and the presentation slides will be shared with everyone who attended and even those who RSVP'd. We received a lot of messages from folks saying that they weren't able to join the live event but wanted the recording. And with that, again, a big thank you to our panelists, to you, the audience, for your participation and engagement. Have a wonderful day, evening, wherever you are, and thank you. Thank you once again. That's a wrap.